This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Renewable energy like hydropower, wind, and solar are seen as viable alternatives to natural gas and coal because renewables don't emit CO2, a gas that contributes to climate change. But federal leadership on the issue has stagnated, so states like Connecticut are moving forward with their own plans to cut carbon emissions. One way to do that is through wind energy. Today, Where We Live, we learn about offshore wind projects that could be starting up in our region. In a few minutes, we'll talk with Vineyard Wind, one of the companies competing to provide Connecticut electricity from offshore wind farms. These companies need ports like Bridgeport and New London to serve as hubs for offshore wind projects. But the quasi-public agency in charge of some of those ports, the Connecticut Port Authority, is facing scrutiny for mismanagement issues. We'll get the latest about those issues from the Connecticut Mirror's Keith Phaneuf coming up. First, the wind energy in the U.S. has grown, wind industry in the U.S. has grown in recent years. But could that change due to a federal tax credit expiring at the end of the year? To tell us more, joining us from NPR studios in Washington, D.C. is Amy Harder, who's a reporter covering energy and climate change at Axios. Amy, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You're talking with us here in Connecticut, where we're not too far from an actual offshore wind farm in Block Island. I believe it's the only offshore wind farm up and running in the U.S. You went out there as part of your reporting. So tell us, describe for us what you saw.
Yeah, well, it's about 15 miles off the mainland of Rhode Island, and the day we went out there was quite windy. So we had waves up to 6 feet. We were doing some filming, so you can imagine it was a little bit tough for the cameramen to be filming with a rocky boat. But it was just incredible to see these massive structures. The turbines in waters are a lot bigger than the ones onshore, and that's part of the reason that there's a lot of appeal for offshore wind, because the amount of electricity you can get is actually a lot more than what you can get onshore.
And so how big is this wind farm off of Block Island, and how much electricity is it creating?
Yeah, so this wind farm off Rhode Island is only about 5 turbines, which is very, very small. Most of the other projects are something like 100 turbines. And it's interesting because companies who are proposing these projects, they talk in terms of megawatt, which of course is the metric for electricity. But when you say something like, 30 megawatts, it doesn't sound like very much, and it isn't. But it's also only 5 turbines. So I like to tell readers how many turbines are going to be in the water because that gives readers a better sense. And so in addition to visiting Block Island, we also went to the potential likely future site for one of the world's largest wind farms, which is off Atlantic City, New Jersey. And that will be 100 turbines, and it will be able to power about 500,000 homes. And so the projects in the pipeline now, including ones in Connecticut, are really just a magnitude order larger. And so I think, obviously, as the projects grow, so does the opposition and concern.
You mentioned these turbines that are offshore are much larger than what we might have seen maybe onshore at the Cape or maybe in western Massachusetts. So explain for our listeners, why there's such interest in offshore wind. You mentioned that it's definitely more windy out there, but when we think about turbines in our backyards, that's not something everybody wants to see.
Right. So I would say there's 2 main advantages for offshore wind over onshore wind. And so one advantage I already mentioned was the fact that you can get more electricity more frequently offshore because it's windier. The other one is that there's relative less opposition because it isn't right in the backyards of people. And NIMBYism, of course, not in my backyard, is a very classic type of opposition that every type of infrastructure project usually faces. However, as I know we'll get into, there is still a lot of opposition to some of these projects, and that's both from other users in the ocean, such as fisheries, and then also people who have homes along the shoreline and are concerned about the cable that will need to be installed to move the electricity, 15 or so miles offshore onto the land in order to connect to the electricity grid. And those cables are buried, but it's nonetheless still a disruption for people.
I mentioned we'll be speaking to Vineyard Wind, just one of three companies that is looking to compete here in Connecticut to bring electricity from offshore wind farms. These projects, if they come online, we're talking about over by Martha's Vineyard. Could you describe where in the ocean these wind turbines could be constructed?
Yeah, well, the key difference between all of the wind farms in the pipeline now, and pretty much the only one that was considered before, is that Cape Wind, which many of your listeners may be familiar with. Cape Wind was actually supposed to be America's first offshore wind farm. It was proposed for just a couple of miles off Martha's Vineyard and Cape Cod. And the proponents of that project tried for 17 years. They finally pulled the plug just a couple of years ago. They tried for 17 years to get that project done and operating. And they got really close for a while. And I covered that pretty closely over the years. And ultimately, it failed for a whole multitude of reasons. But one main one is that wealthy people, including the Kennedy family, who have a compound on in that area, didn't want to see the turbines from their property, and so it didn't go through. So now these projects, you can barely see them on the horizon when you're on the beach, and that's really important because ultimately, while there is opposition now, it is out of sight, out of mind in a way that wasn't there before.
Amy Harder is with us from NPR's Washington, D.C. studios. She's a reporter covering energy and climate change for Axios. We invited Amy on to learn more about offshore wind projects that are coming online or hoping to in this region, specifically in Connecticut now. Three companies that have put together proposals to bring wind energy to our state. We'll be talking with one of them in just a few moments. You can join our conversation, 888-720-9677. If you have a question about these offshore wind projects. I'm curious, Amy, we see interest lately in recent years from consumers as well as some politicians that don't want to see our country rely so much on fossil fuels because of climate change. I'm curious how far advanced European countries are in terms of bringing offshore wind projects online there.
Yeah, so Europe really is the leader in offshore wind. Denmark and the UK are really the ones that have perfected this technology. And Denmark gets a very large proportion, something like 60% or more of its electricity comes from wind, largely offshore wind. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that Europe as a continent is just far more progressive and has traditionally been more concerned about climate change and environmental issues compared to the United States. But also, importantly, Europeans are also more accustomed to paying higher electricity prices. And currently, right now, offshore wind remains more expensive than other forms of electricity like natural gas or coal. And so that's one reason why Europe has really led the world in this technology. And in fact, now a lot of the companies you're seeing put in investment here in the United States for offshore wind are actually European companies. The company that we've worked with, which is for our reporting and the one who's the leader in offshore wind around the world, is Ørsted, which is a Denmark-based company, and it actually used to be an oil and gas company. And so you're seeing Shell and Equinor, which is a Norwegian-based oil company, they're taking an interest in this because there's actually a lot of similarities between offshore wind and offshore oil. So
tell us more about the similarities when you say that.
Yeah, so the types of the massive structures that are going into the water, whether it's an offshore oil rig or an offshore wind rig, are actually quite similar. And I've been to both now after my trip to Block Island. And the International Energy Agency, which is sort of a global intergovernmental energy research group, they recently concluded that the costs for offshore wind can be about 40% of the same costs that offshore oil faces. And that's because the structure, the platforms that either the turbine or the drilling rig go on are very similar. And so companies that are servicing the offshore oil industry are the same that are servicing the offshore wind. And in fact, the platforms that were built in Block Island were made in Louisiana, which is, of course, home to America's offshore oil industry. And so that's one reason why I think the potential here is a lot larger than it is for, say, onshore solar, because you have these really deep-pocketed companies putting some of their money into it.
And you mentioned Ørsted, which is also another company hoping to be chosen as a company that can bring wind energy to Connecticut. And again, we'll be talking more about Connecticut focus in just a little bit. I'm bringing this all up also because we know our country is withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord. This would have helped with goals to reduce emissions in our country. And I'm just wondering how that impacts these projects when we have an administration that also seems to have an issue with wind energy. I just want to play a clip from President Trump, who spoke at a rally about renewables in August.
And then all of a sudden it stops. The wind and the televisions go off. And your wives and husbands say, "Darling, I want to watch Donald Trump on television tonight. But the wind stopped blowing and I can't watch. There's no electricity in the house, darling."
He's poking fun at this idea of offshore and onshore wind turbines helping provide electricity to Americans. I mean, what's your take, Amy, from reporting, and what's been going on in terms of rolling back regulations on fossil fuels that can impact the growth here of wind energy?
There's a lot going on here, and it's always, as has typically been the case with the Trump administration, a little bit hard to understand what are the motivations here. So just to unpack this a little bit. So it's very clear that President Trump does not like wind energy. And Trump himself he's not the most, he changes his opinions on a lot of things. But there's a few things that he's been very reliably opposed or supportive of. And one of them has been that he really doesn't like wind. And my sources I talked to say one obvious reason for that is he was fighting an offshore wind farm that was, in his words, obstructing the views of one of his golf courses in Scotland. That actually recently just got decided in a court there, and he lost that battle. So there's just sort of some NIMBYism there that is a legacy issue that I think is informing the president's views. However, I think President Trump's hatred for wind so far doesn't seem to be actually impacting all of these offshore wind projects, which seems odd because I think if he cared enough to learn about this, I think it would be a net negative for all of these companies. I don't think there's any way that Trump could learn that, oh, look at what my administration is doing to help all these offshore wind projects and support them. He would almost certainly oppose them and try to slow down the process as president if that was something he cared enough about. I can't tell at this point in time if he does. Now, to your other point about fossil fuels, now, of course, this has been the core of this administration's agenda is reviving the coal industry, which they have not succeeded in doing, and repealing all of the regulations that the Obama administration had issued. And so that's where the president's political energy has gone. And so that's why the offshore wind issues are sort of bubbling beneath his radar and for now have avoided the spotlight, which, again, as I say, is actually probably good for the industry, given the history that Trump has with offshore wind. And as far as the Paris Climate Agreement goes, I certainly think, and to be clear, of course, it is moving forward just without the United States involvement. I think the U.S. involvement in that obviously would have been an overall positive step and positive boost for offshore wind, but it's not a make or break issue. I think more eminent and tangible issues such as the investment tax credit that is expiring at the end of the year and may be renewed in Congress, those types of things have a much more tangible impact on these companies' bottom lines. And so that's something that I think these companies are watching more closely.
You mentioned that tax credit that's set to expire. So tell us in recent years how much that incentive has driven these companies to invest in wind energy.
Yeah, it's been critical. And I think that, would be a great question for the head of Vineyard Wind to talk about as well, because I know some of their projects, in particular the one in Massachusetts, which is the focus of a government delay at the moment, is really depending upon that tax credit. And again, these tax credits are important because they help lower the cost of electricity. In the United States, the cost of electricity is just less than what it is in Europe. So these incentives are really important. Now, this is pretty normal for any sort of new energy technology to get government incentives. onshore wind and solar still continue, in fact, to have these tax incentives for them. The proponents of wind and solar like to say that fracking, the controversial natural gas and oil extraction technique, also had government support before it really took off. So this is pretty normal. And I tend to think there's probably greater than not odds that Congress will extend this tax credit because there's greater awareness and concern for climate change. Yet there's really no policy on the table for Republicans and Democrats to support in the name of climate change other than these tax incentives. So for that reason, I do think it's somewhat likely that it will sort of squeak through at the end of the year.
You mentioned giving us some context on what's happening on the federal level. Meanwhile, you have states like Connecticut that are doing regional efforts. So RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a mandatory agreement among northeastern states that we can also reach certain emission reduction targets by certain years. And so that's also driving this investment in wind energy because the federal government's taking one tact and states are trying to be proactive and keep it moving forward?
Yes, definitely. In reaction to the Trump administration retreating on climate change, both on a federal policy and also the global climate level, the states, particularly in New England and Mid-Atlantic, but also, of course, California, they're really sort of stepping in and doubling down and issuing perhaps even more aggressive policies than they would have absent the Trump retreat. And so that is, I think, maybe second or somewhat equal to the government tax policy is really important to continue to have that incentive for these companies to invest here absent federal government incentives. Now, I think it's important to note that the Interior Department, which is, the U.S. government agency controlling federal waters, it has been somewhat a little bit on and off in terms of its support for offshore wind. But mostly, and as of right now, we're sort of waiting to get more information about this broader review that the Interior Department is doing. But for now, it does appear that the Interior Department is sort of moving cautiously to support offshore wind. And so, again, that's sort of absent the Trump effect of the fact that Trump doesn't like wind. But one government official recently said at a conference that he supports offshore wind. The Interior Secretary himself has been less vocal, but he hasn't been vocally critical either. So it's a little bit like reading tea leaves, but I think for now the industry is trying to be cautiously optimistic that they won't run into the Trump Twitter problem or, more predictable problems, which is things like what Cape Wind ran into in terms of local and political opposition to the project itself.
Amy Harder is a reporter covering energy and climate change at Axios. She's joining us here on Where We Live as we learn more about offshore wind projects that can impact our region. Coming up after the break, the CEO of Vineyard Wind will join us. He's leading one of the companies that has responded to Connecticut's request for offshore wind proposals. Do you have a question about how this will impact you? You can join us 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. The state of Connecticut has set a goal for a clean energy future, and it's looking to wind energy. Governor Lamont wants up to 2,000 megawatt of electricity from offshore wind injected into the state by 2030. To get there, the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, or DEEP, is weighing three proposals from three offshore wind companies. Vineyard Wind is one of them. Joining me now in studio is Lars Peterson, the company's CEO. We wanted to learn more about Vineyard Wind and its plans for Connecticut ports to support offshore wind farms. Lars, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So you're from Denmark, and
that's correct.
You've been working in the States. First off, you had a big project, a partnership or a proposal that was accepted by the state of Massachusetts that could bring wind energy to impact Massachusetts residents. So can you update us on what's happening there and how that could impact your Connecticut proposals?
Yeah, so Vineyard Wind won the first large-scale offshore wind contract in 2018. It was put out by the state of Massachusetts, 800 megawatts. So we became the first large-scale project in the U.S. to go through the permitting of this new technology in the U.S. We have been progressing well, and most recently, given that the industry has actually been growing immensely after we demonstrated with our project that not only could we deliver clean energy, but we could also deliver affordable energy. States up and down the eastern seaboard responded. So the industry grew from basically our project, 800 megawatt, what is now into 25,000 megawatts. And the federal government has decided that before they will approve the first project, which was our project, they want to do a more programmatic review of all offshore wind farms planned up and down the eastern seaboard. So right now we are waiting for the final federal approval. We have more or less all our state and local permits in hand.
How does this tax credit that's expiring impact your bottom line, but also what your company promised Massachusetts in terms of delivering super cheap energy?
It's clear that the tax credits are part of the commercial proposal. When the federal government introduces a delay, there are mechanisms in the tax code that allows you to delay some of the tax credits, and we're in a constant dialogue with Treasury on how to handle this. We continue to be very, very confident that we will deliver the first large-scale project, and we're basically waiting for the approval to move forward.
And so you have leased federal waters to build, again, this massive offshore wind farm off the coast of New England near Martha's Vineyard. And so I'm just curious, again, if you could describe for our listeners in terms of megawatts that we're talking about, how does that impact a Connecticut resident in terms of their electricity and their electricity bill? Will it impact them?
We think it will impact in a positive way. So our project in Massachusetts is actually deemed to save ratepayers $1.6 billion over the lifetime compared to the cheapest alternative that the state would otherwise have had. As was described earlier on in your segment, the reason why we're here is basically because the fundamentals are really great for offshore wind. You have strong winds at sea, you have constant winds at sea, you have the peak production when the system needs it during the wintertime, so you can create cheap and affordable clean energy. And while doing that, you can create an industry that creates jobs during construction, but also during the 30 years where the projects have to be serviced. So it's a job creation, it's a clean and affordable energy. We believe that we can demonstrate that to Connecticut as well, that we can deliver clean and affordable energy.
Amy Harder is also with us from NPR's Washington studio, again, a reporter covering energy and climate change at Axios. Amy, what are some other considerations that the federal government, with their evaluation and assessment, but also states like Connecticut should be thinking about in terms of if and when these wind turbines go up in the ocean? What are some of the impacts that people should be considering?
The concerns that the Interior Department at the U.S. government level is looking at, the biggest one is the impact on other users in the ocean. So commercial fisheries, think about the food that we eat that comes from the ocean. These are the people that are concerned about it. And I know this is obviously something that Vineyard Wind follows closely. So I think that's the biggest one. I think on a larger scale, as offshore wind, if all of these projects come through, I think the Energy Department has said that there's the amount of megawatts that are in proposal right now up and down the coast in New England and the Mid-Atlantic could power almost 10 million homes. And so as offshore wind and onshore wind and solar grow to be a significant percentage of our U.S. electricity mix, the question of ensuring that there is always electricity available is important. And of course, Trump says falsely that when it's not windy, you can't turn the TV on. But he does tap into a concern that electricity regulators need to keep an eye on as these projects become a bigger part of the mix. And again, that's why offshore wind is so appealing, because it is more reliable than onshore wind.
Lars Peterson, again, CEO of Vineyard Wind. So how is your company addressing some of those concerns, including impact on fisheries?
Yeah, I think it's a good and relevant question. Of course, if you've had unimpeded access to the ocean for centuries, you are nervous if there's a new industry coming that want to co-share the ocean with you. I think we did already in our first proposal try to propose a way of orienting and spacing the turbines that would allow for commercial fishing to coexist. It's also clear that we're not always in agreement with the commercial fishing industry, how wide and which orientation it should be laid out at. I think we have responded to some of the concerns. I think we as an industry have actually responded, and we will soon come out with a proposal that we think will be very responsive to the concerns we have had. We have seen in other parts of the world that fisheries and offshore wind can coexist. The turbines are spaced very far apart. They are more than a mile apart, what we are proposing right now. So that should allow for fishing vessels to go in between and continue fishing and do what they have done for centuries. And also what we have seen in other parts of the world is that when you put these structures out in the ocean, it actually creates artificial reefs. So you tend to see more fish congregating and more fish actually being around because of these structures. So if we can find a good way allowing for commercial fishing to continue what they have been doing and build these, maybe it's a win-win for everybody.
Did your company bring in this concern and trying to work with fisheries early enough in the process, would you say?
I think with hindsight, you can always do more. I think we were the first project to bring on a fisheries liaison. So basically us paying someone in the fishing community to give feedback to us on how we could best design this project. We have just recently named another fisheries liaison for the state of Connecticut as we want to build projects here. I think with hindsight, we could have done a better job. We always had it in mind. We didn't see eye to eye with everybody on what the best solution is, and we have responded to that so that we can move forward. We want to be coexisting with commercial fishing. It shouldn't be either offshore wind or commercial fishing. It should be both, and we are very confident that we can do that.
Again, Lars Peterson is CEO of Vineyard Wind here on Where We Live as we talk about these offshore wind projects that have been proposed, closer to Martha's Vineyard, but again, bringing wind energy to the state of Connecticut. Your company is one of three that has submitted proposals to the state of Connecticut. There's Constitution Wind, the collaboration between Ørsted, which we heard from Amy, another Danish company, and Eversource as well, and then Mayflower Wind, which is a collaboration between Shell and another European company, EDP Renewables. So tell us more about your proposal for Connecticut, Lars, and exactly, with the competition for bringing wind energy to our state, the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection will soon be announcing their choice after a review. Ørsted also has a partnership, or trying to get a partnership in place with the new London State Pier. And so there's a lot of moving parts, so to speak. And how do you set your proposal apart from these?
Thank you. We are super excited to participate in the state RFP. I think if you think big picture about the Eastern Seaboard, it is just one of the best places in the world to build offshore wind. And that means that we can build quite a lot of it without creating, NIMBYism, that you can see it. We think we can coexist well with commercial fishing. And given that these projects they end up with a wind turbine, that's the visible thing you can see. But before you get there, it's actually a massive marine construction project. So while we build these projects, we will create a lot of jobs in the states and in and around the ports that we'll be using. So we have named our 5 proposals. We responded with 5 different proposals. Park City Wind. We want to be centered in and around Bridgeport. We want to revitalize underutilized waterfronts to construction harbors and long-term service facilities. And we do that because when we see this industry growing up and down the Eastern Seaboard, one of the things that are in short supply are ports. Mm-hmm. But more notably, ports that don't sit behind bridges. The way you build these projects is that you have basically a floating crane that has long legs that it can lift to the seabed and lift the crane out of the water. And in order to get those crane vessels into a port, you need a port that doesn't sit behind bridges. And there are very few of those on the Eastern Seaboard, actually. So when we look at this business opportunity for us up and down the Eastern Seaboard, we can see that we need to develop 10 ports. We have maybe 4 or 5 right now, and Connecticut is actually very fortunate that they have 2 of those sites. They have New London, And Bridgeport, we want to transform that into the next offshore wind port that we can use for these projects, but also for other projects.
So your choice in Bridgeport, does that have to do with Ørsted in negotiations with the state to operate New London State Pier? Would you have any ability to operate out of there if the state awards awards or accepts a proposal from, say, Ørsted and also you? Is that possible?
I think it could be possible. I think the answer is not either or. It's actually we need both to continue this industry. And I think for Connecticut, the opportunity is to create jobs as part of the projects that we deliver for Connecticut. But we as a business, we actually see this as a port facility or a region that we can use for projects that we're bidding into New York or to Massachusetts because we're on short supply of these ports. So for Connecticut, going first, going big, and trying to plant a flag with some of the key infrastructure could mean that jobs would be created as part of the first project, but also as the industry develops.
The day of New London reporting that Ørsted and energy company Eversource have sweetened their deal, so to speak, in their bid to supply offshore wind to Connecticut, now promising $100 million to a variety of local agencies and initiatives if chosen by the state. So how does that impact, again, your proposal? And what are you doing to entice lawmakers to choose your company?
I think we try to create a very comprehensive package. Ultimately, we want to deliver clean and affordable energy to Connecticut consumers. We are a business. We are strong believers in offshore wind being a large part of the energy mix here on the eastern seaboard. So we want to create a new port in and around Bridgeport. We want to attract manufacturing facilities. We have actually made an agreement with a company that has existed here in Connecticut for more than 150 years, Keyride, that they are currently supplying cables for power projects onshore that we want to help them get into the global offshore wind business we have teamed up with them and saying we want to buy your product so that you can convert it from onshore to offshore. So we want to develop a port. We want to bring manufacturing into Bridgeport. We want Keyride to build a new factory, and we want to create our long-term O&M hub, so operation and maintenance out of Bridgeport. So we have that, and then we have also teamed up with unions guaranteeing that we will be creating well-paying jobs while we are building these projects as well.
Amy Harder's with us as well, a reporter covering energy and climate change at Axios. Amy, I'm wondering, in your reporting, as we talk about this competitive bid process going on here in Connecticut with these three companies, is that typical in terms of other projects that are coming online or the possibility along the eastern seaboard?
Yes, there's been a lot of competition for the leases in federal and state waters, and I understand that there's been even some oil companies that have not won any leases that are trying to bid on some of these. So I think you see a lot of interest, and I think that's indicative of both the potential here, but also again the crossover between the oil and the wind industry. I asked Bloomberg New Energy Finance to crunch some numbers for me for a story recently, and they found that 30% of the leases in the U.S. Have some involvement from oil and gas companies, and that's not even including Ørsted, which used to be an oil and gas company. Mm-hmm. So I really think there's been a lot of interest, and more interest, I would say, than leases for offshore oil, and I think that's just indicative of where the industry writ large is going, and dynamics in the oil industry as well. So it's certainly been interesting, something that I will continue to watch to see if the leasing continues to be really competitive, even as there's this sort of, you want to call it a hiccup or a speed bump or a big obstacle in terms of this review the Interior Department is pursuing.
Lars.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think it is important to understand that this has grown to be a huge business opportunity, a huge industry coming off the ground on the eastern seaboard right now with 25,000 megawatts. Mm-hmm. It's $100 billion that is going to be invested up and down the eastern seaboard in the next 10 years. It is going to create thousands and thousands of jobs. Our projects that we are proposing for Connecticut, it's $1.6 billion in economic activity, 12,000 jobs. And we do that because these are big and bulky components. It's actually a marine construction project. It ends with an offshore wind turbine. That's what you can see. But these are large marine construction projects, very complex projects, but also big job creators. So I think the states have shown a great interest in harnessing the wind offshore, but also capturing the economic development opportunities that follows this. it's a quite unique situation, and it's a once-in-a-generation opportunity to create a new industry that revitalizes waterfronts up and down the eastern seaboard.
Is it frustrating to see our federal government here in the United States taking their time when we've already heard that European nations are ahead of the curve in terms of bringing renewables to people?
I think long-term for us, it's important that the federal government has a predictable process and that we know what the parameters are to successfully go through permitting. We would, of course, have hoped that we hadn't had this delay. It impacts our projects, the first one, but we think that we will find a way through this so that we can have a predictable way of going through the permitting process, and also a predictable way for other ocean users to see this industry developing, so we don't have to repeat the same discussions project by project, but that we have an industry-wide solution. So long term, we are extremely bullish on the potential for offshore wind. We want to be part of this industry growing here. A predictable federal process is part of it. We are happy that there's a large-scale review, and we look forward to concluding that review and moving forward with the individual projects.
And then just to clarify again, these delays that you face, your company faces, again, how does that impact the cheap rates that you promised in these proposals that Connecticut residents may see?
So that wouldn't change anything. When we submitted our bids for Connecticut, we were well aware of the current delays for the first project, so we built that into our plans and our prices, so nothing would change in that proposal.
Before we let you go, Lars Peterson, again, who's CEO of Vineyard Wind. In Connecticut, there's been a lot of attention on issues within the Connecticut Port Authority, which is the economic development arm to help, say, Connecticut suppliers do business with a company like yours with these projects, these offshore wind farms that are hoping to come online. What is your take on the mismanagement that has been widely reported? And how does that impact the way that you hope to do business with say, some of these local companies if you get the proposal accepted in Bridgeport?
So our proposal in Bridgeport is a fully private initiative. So I am aware that there are some discussions in and around New London. Ultimately, we hope that New London and Bridgeport becomes a port. I can't really speak to the details. It's not really part of our proposal, and we have made a proposal that would be a fully private initiative.
I wanted to go back to Amy Harder from Axios. Listeners of our station aren't just concerned about electricity costs, they're also concerned about climate change. And so when they hear about these offshore projects along the eastern seaboard, in terms of a timeline that's realistic for people that they would see these projects coming online, Amy, is it too soon to tell?
I think a lot of the projects are slated for the early 2020s to mid-2020s. And that's just because, number one, some of these delays are having somewhat of an impact. And I know Lars has spoken to that about his company's projects. But I think, these things the permitting process is so much more arduous in the United States than in Europe. So an Ørsted official told me that there's about 20 government agencies that a company needs to go through for the permitting here in the United States. In Europe, he said there's just one, basically. And so that really illustrates to you why it takes a lot of time. And so I think that explains why 2022 and 3 and 4 is when you can really see these projects in the pipeline. And I tend to think that the concern for climate change and the urgency around the issue will only grow, which I think will continue to increase the societal support for these things and the less salience of the NIMBYism arguments. I think that was more powerful, when Cape Wind was going through the process. I don't think NIMBYism holds as much water as it did before. Now, that's different from the concerns from the commercial fisheries, who, unfortunately are also dealing with the impacts of climate change itself, with warming waters. And so, these fisheries are sort of facing a 1-2 punch. But yeah, I would say mid-2020s is give and take when a lot of these projects are hoping to come online.
Again, Amy Harder joining us today from NPR's Washington, D.C. studios. Amy, thanks for your time from Axios. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks so much.
Also, Lars Peterson, CEO of Vineyard Wind. We appreciate your flexibility in coming in today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. After the break, Connecticut Mirror's Keith Phaneuf joins us to bring us up to date on the issues I mentioned at the Connecticut Port Authority. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We hope we got you up to speed on this competition for offshore wind energy in Connecticut. But there's another issue that's important if the state wants to support this growing industry, and that's the Connecticut Port Authority and how it supports economic development to specific ports that could also support these offshore wind companies. Joining us now to tell us more about what's been going on with the Connecticut Port Authority is Keith Phaneuf in studio with me. You know him well, reporter for the Connecticut Mirror. Keith, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about the Connecticut Port Authority, one of several quasi-public agencies in the state. When was it created? And, talk more about its purpose.
Sure. Well, it was created approximately 5 years ago. And Connecticut has always sort of had this chip on its shoulder about its deep water ports, the thought that we haven't done enough with the economic development potential for New London and New Haven and Bridgeport. Connecticut has had success with the Connecticut Airport Authority in expanding the role of Bradley and other airports. So that's the goal here, to get a group that's going to do everything they can to market the region and help work with businesses and other groups who are looking to do things in Long Island Sound, around Long Island Sound. It's a group that there were a lot of expectations tied to.
So I mentioned earlier, Ørsted and Eversource is one of the companies that's actually in negotiations with the state, I believe, to take over operations or to work out of the New London State Pier. So that would be an example of the Port Authority is involved in those negotiations?
Right. I always still want to say DEP, but there's an extra E now. The Department of Energy and Environmental Protection basically invited companies to put out RFPs for wind generation facilities this summer. And as you talked about earlier in the show, you had proposals. There's one that would be about 65 miles offshore from New London. There would be others also, one offshore off Bridgeport. And it would mean not just wind generation, but there would be business in the area, whether it's assembling these, doing other type of support services on them. So they're an economic development driver, a magnet.
Mm-hmm. And so what's been going on in recent months related to mismanagement at the Connecticut Port Authority?
Yeah, well, that's the other thing is that when you're trying to generate excitement around, state government never likes a public black eye, period. They're just not fun. And then when you're trying to generate excitement around something, it's definitely, it throws water on the fire. And in this case, things were coming out this summer that the authority had been spending somewhat liberally. There were reports that the former chairwoman of the authority had used authority funds to purchase. They purchased professional photos of the chairwoman's daughter, and they were hung in taken by the chairwoman's daughter, and they were hung in the authority offices. The state auditors found a lot of fine dining and money spent in some cases on hotel stays that didn't make sense. The authority has offices in Old Saybrook, and some officials stayed at an expensive hotel in Mystic for a meeting in Darien. And if you're doing this map in your head, not everything lines up.
Yeah. Just to be more specific, so auditors finding almost $2,000 spent on alcohol, $500 plus on restaurant charges during hotel stays, $3,000 on photographs by the then chairwoman's daughter. We did reach out to DECD, David Corus, who's now the interim chairperson of the Connecticut Port Authority, and he writes, "Nothing in the audit came as a surprise to us, and now they're working on policies, procedures, controls, quote, to mitigate the risk of issues occurring at the Connecticut Port Authority in the future. This brings the question to many is that, why does this have to happen to start? That there are not, shouldn't these leaders of these agencies be following certain ethics to not have to have this black eye to then cause change to be made?
Well, Lucy, you might have been channeling Governor Lamont there, because he was saying,
don't say that.
Why did this have to happen? Because let's just point something out. He inherited this problem. Okay, Governor Lamont took office in January. All of this had, all these appointments all had been up and running under prior legislatures and the prior administration of Governor Malloy. So he comes in January, and his folks start to hear these same rumblings, and they're looking into it. So they tried to move. Even before this last report from the state auditors, like you pointed out, the governor put in his deputy DECD commissioner, David Corris, to basically go in and ride herd over this. He's assigned staff from his budget office, from Connecticut Innovations, which is our quasi-public economic development arm. They're going in trying to rewrite policies and make sure that businesses looking to develop in our ports think that we have our act together. So I'm sure he was saying, why does this have to be going on now? But you also raise another point, which is legislators are also saying, what if this is going on with other quasi-publics? We don't know that it is. I don't want to, speculate. Or what if there's a flaw in the way we get these off the ground? Maybe we need to take this all the way back to formula, just to make sure the problem is not more widespread.
I was thinking back to when there was conversation about whether there should be a toll authority implemented if tolls ever come to the state of Connecticut. No wonder people are concerned about these quasi-publics coming online when there are issues like this, Keith. Yeah,
because there also is there's a myth about quasi-public. I was talking with some of your staff yesterday. I said being quasi-public is kind of like being quasi-pregnant. It's really not possible. These are still public entities. They're created by the state legislature. The legislature doesn't give birth to private entities. They created them. They can take them away. We call them quasi-public because they look like they're part public and they're part private. They have aspects that are similar to private entities, but they're absolutely accountable to the taxpayers of the state of Connecticut. That's why these black eyes are so embarrassing.
You have a story in the Mirror this morning. Is it time to move on? Should lawmakers in the General Assembly continue to ask for public hearings on this?
Well, and particularly legislators from the shoreline, from southeastern Connecticut, from both parties. And people thought, initially the calls were coming from the Republicans, and some people thought maybe there was partisan politics at play. Prominent Democrats from southeastern Connecticut, like Senator Kathy Austin, Representative Christine Conley from Groton, they're saying, no, we need to pull this apart. And the legislative committee that would have jurisdiction, the Transportation Committee, one of the two co-chairs, Roland Lamar from New Haven, has said, we really need one more public hearing. This is not about beating a dead horse. We'd like to sit down, talk to the auditors. I mean, even when you're looking at a state audit, that's a summary of everything they found. And it's not because the auditors are hiding anything. They have enormous amounts of supporting documentation that are also there that just don't all go into the final audit. I think they definitely want to sit down and break things down with them and have a more candid discussion about just how severe the problem was.
Well, I want to thank Keith for coming in to provide more context on this story that has received headlines in recent months. Again, mismanagement at the Connecticut Port Authority. The state says they are making changes as we speak. I'd love to have you back on, Keith, to see what comes out of all of this, and of course when the session starts too. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. Thanks to our technical producer, Kyone Wolf. You can learn more about the show. Just download Where We Live on your favorite podcast app. Have a great weekend.